now I feel like I see things. I go to an art show or like I talk to somebody who's really passionate about what they're doing, or I'm in a studio with somebody or watching something that's inspiring, and I feel so inspired, like this like brief circuit of kind of like, oh, I need to make something right now immediately. Um, and then, you know, other things happen as they do so frequently. But I do like those moments, I really cling on to those, the moments of like necessity for creativity. And I'm like, how do I, just inject this into myself when I need it the most? At 4 o'clock on a Tuesday, or at an 8 a.m. on a Tuesday. So I am a native Western Masser, born and raised in Springfield area. Went to the University of Massachusetts in Amherst and got my BFA in printmaking. I graduated in 2013. I realized that I really kind of needed a community outside of college, and kind of started to seek out studio spaces in the area. I connected with some folks who had a space in the Arts and Industries building, and of course we're looking for another person on Craigslist. And we linked up, and they were really great, but I realized that I needed to kind of link up with more printmakers. I had heard about ZMAs through friends who had done the internship here, and I kind of reached out and started to get involved. And for those who are not familiar with ZMAs, it's a community-based print studio located in Florence, Massachusetts, that's focused on creating less toxic forms of printmaking, which is great, also something that I feel very passionate about. So I, remained in the area. I left, took a brief little hiatus at the east end of Long Island in East Hampton, New York, a different Hampton, and I was able to get some practice teaching printmaking and ceramics and a few other things. Then I moved back here and kind of really started to develop the portfolio of work that I've been making for the past 5 years. And, was so thankful for the community that I have here to be able to return to and kind of get a good perspective on my work and an interest from it and whatnot. So, like I said, I'm a printmaker, but specifically I work in etching, which is a form of intaglio printmaking. In intaglio printmaking, I guess the biggest contrast that people make to it, or the opposing type of printmaking really, is relief. And so relief printmaking is most easily compared to making a stamp, where you're kind of carving out something, you're rolling ink onto that surface, and you're then running that through a press. And the result is that the parts that you carved out are the negative space or the white space. With intaglio printmaking, you're creating these marks within a matrix or a surface. And then the ink is applied, but the surfaces that are on the upmost layer are wiped away. The ink is wiped off of that. And then you run that through the press with a softened piece of damp paper, and the ink is pulled up from those grooves. So one is pulling from the surface, and the other, the one that I do, intaglio or etching, is pulled from the grooves of that. There is a ground that's applied to a piece of copper. So essentially, the red that's here is not naturally the color of the copper. I've applied this thing called a ground. And so normally it looks like this. This is a solidified ground before I've drawn into it. You then take a sharp needle, an etching needle, or a twisted scribe, and it's just a sharp piece of metal, to then scratch in the marks onto the plate. So the next step after I get all of these marks completed is to then drop it into the acid bath. It eats away at the marks, thus creating the grooves, like I had mentioned before. And then I pull all of this off, and I'm left with the raw copper, and then I can just ink it up, run it through the press, and my marks are then put onto the piece of paper like this. Most of my prints include, the finalized prints include some tonal variation, so oftentimes an aquatint is involved. And I like to think of it as kind of like a pixelation process, but like very old school. You're applying, traditionally you're applying rosin, which is like a very toxic dust. It's very flammable, and it goes right onto the plate. And it's very small dust particles. That's then hardened to the plate. It acts in a way as a resist, so like the dust particles are eaten around by the acid once it's dropped into the acid bath. But if you stop anything out with an acid resist, like I said, like this ground, or in this case a stop out, which is an acrylic-based thing, the acid won't touch those parts. So you have these marks that are created around these particles. And so there's large spans of tone that are able to be created on these. And the deeper the marks, or deeper the etch, the darker it is. So when you see different tonal variations in my work, it's because I've placed them in the acid at different times. So say I want a light gray, I'm going to drop that in for 5 seconds. Then I'm going to, or maybe 15 seconds. And then I'm going to stop that out. And then I'm going to, everything that still remains on the plate is going to go back into the acid for, another minute or two, until I'm doing that maybe like 5 or 6 times until I reach my blacks. And the blacks are normally in there for like 20 minutes. So it's really a methodical and just well thought out process in a way. I like to say well thought out. It's really not as well thought out as it should be sometimes. But it is, it has to be planned. The tediousness and the methodicalness of this process is very much like meditation in a way, and I think really reflects myself, and also a lot of printmakers, or the individual, and also the type of printmaking. Like you can get very painterly with a monoprint, because it's, you're applying ink to a single piece of plexiglass and running it through a press, and it's a monoprint because it's just one print. But in this case, it is like a form of meditation in a lot of ways. When I first graduated from UMass and was out of my undergrad, I was like, this is something that I love to do, but I don't have access to it. And I'm blessed enough to be in an area that is kind of rich with print community, as opposed to other places that's not. This is kind of, ZMAs is like a gold mine of there's however many print presses here, and to have access to that is really great, and a lot of folks don't. So I think it's important, and it was for me at least, as soon as I got out of my undergrad, to really find the community of printmakers and artists that I could relate to and find comfort in. I think that my work is really a lot about community in a lot of different ways. So it just makes sense that was the place that I was driven to. My work, like I said, is a lot about community. And this, I think, is just, it feels like one big journal entry in a weird way. And I a lot of times make it for myself. I think we all do, and then we just find ways that make it accessible for other people to do whatever they need to do with it, and that's fine. Do it. I don't want to know about it. And it's, I think that I am consciously trying to rationalize things and try to think about, what is this like for me? What is this like for the viewer, my audience? And I'm always thinking of these are very intimate narratives that are based on life experiences that I've had. And so each of these, like I said, is like a journal entry. It's like a moment of intimacy that I've shared with a partner, or, a moment of anger that I've shared with a family member, a moment of love that I shared with a family member, an instance that I've shared with somebody who's just, verbally assaulted me on the street for no reason, just for being, gay or something. I don't know. And these are ways for me to kind of dissect those. And so each of them means a very specific thing to me. But I also am consciously trying to make them accessible to the viewer. So I do that by oftentimes making the figures more ambiguous. A lot of times they aren't addressing any actual person, even though they are referencing people. They're oftentimes not facing the viewer's plane. And there's a lot of like drama in them, I would say. Heavy shadows, like a lot of contrasting tones. There's a lot of like shifts in those tones that are stark. You know, all of my transitions are very stark. I mean, I like to think that in a weird way, and I'm always like on the fence about, you know, how do I identify as like an artist and what seems right. And it just seems like I started off making art in this kind of like safe space that was like safe for me and just safe for the general audience. And then the more comfortable I've gotten over the past few years, you know, it's become more provocative. The imagery that I'm using of just like nude bodies, phalluses, butts, all of these things, is provocative in a way that it feels like kind of an unveiling. And seemingly like I haven't been able to do that to a certain extent before, and that, you know, this full sense of self is kind of coming to me after having returned to this area and feeling kind of independent of where I was previously. I think that I compartmentalize a lot of things in my life, a lot of identities, and have done so, you know, until kind of recently, maybe like within the past 4 years or so. And so this really, I think it is a timeline. This body of work is a timeline. I guess for after coming out of 2020, and my experience with the pandemic and everything, I was not as fruitful as some might have been. I think a lot of people were struggling with that, and I just didn't feel the need to. I was focusing on other forms of survival in a lot of ways. And so looking at 2021, it doesn't feel like a fresh start, and maybe it feels weird to categorize 2021 as a fresh start given everything that everybody went through in such different capacities and different situations of different means. So, but it does feel like a good time to rethink about my trajectory. And, you know, the ways in which I practice art. And printmaking has been so integral in my life for so long, and it will forever be there, but also how can I expand upon these things and maybe take it into a different direction. I don't have any set shows or projects coming up. I currently have a show in Dayton, Ohio at this place called the Dana Wiley Gallery, which is great. And am happy to show the work that I have here, but also really excited to build upon it. I think like we went from this period of like really concentrated, we're getting this done, this done, this done, this done, to like a year of either you're really overworked or you have a lot of free time and you're really stressed about all that free time, to this moment where we're like, oh, things are going back to that first one, and I'm not sure how I feel about it, but it feels like a good thing. But it's also another type of exhaustion, you know, just like re-stretching that muscle memory, and like being in a pandemic and like constantly having my mind jet to this one thing, or this like, how do I do this base thing to live, or you know, getting money, or will somebody, you know, will I have a job outside of this thing? It really pulls from my attention span to feel inspired. And so all of my energy is then going to this one thing, this concentration of like just existing. So when it comes time to make work, I'm like, oh wait, what did I, you know, do today besides like look for work or do like these things that I'm not used to doing, and then relearning this other thing to then do this to make money, or, you know, just scrounging things together. Labor is exhausting always, and oftentimes, you know, if you're not doing labor, it's luxurious, and it's definitely a privilege to not have to do that. And I think we take our free time for granted too much, maybe sometimes. So